This program is funded through a More Perfect Union initiative of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you for joining us for the Connected Conversations program with the Idaho Humanities Council. I'm Robin Achilles, Executive Director for Friends of Minidoka. Friends of Minidoka is the philanthropic nonprofit partner of Minidoka National Historic Site, a unit of the National Park Service located in Jerome, Idaho. During World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from the West Coast and unconstitutionally incarcerated during World War II. 13,000 men, women, and children from Alaska, Oregon, and Washington were incarcerated at Minidoka. This month, we are commemorating the 80th anniversary of the arrival of incarcerees to the historic Minidoka War Relocation Center. In the first of this three-part series, Kurt Ikeda, Director of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka, shared information on the history and legacy of Minidoka. In the second program, Dr. Donna Nagata, Professor of Psychology in the Clinical Science area at the University of Michigan, spoke to us about her research on the multi-generational impacts of the World War II incarceration upon Japanese Americans, intergenerational processes, and historical trauma. Historical trauma is defined as trauma that is shared by a group and spans multiple generations. In today's program, 80 Years of Reckoning, the Survivor and Descendant panel, we have Minidoka survivors and descendants with us to discuss their reactions to Dr. Nagata's research about multi-generational trauma, share their own experiences, and our hopes for the future. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to quickly review a few terms so we have a common understanding. Nisei are the first generation of Japanese immigrants to the United States. This generation was barred from becoming US citizens through naturalization due to restrictive immigration laws. It was not until the 1950s that the Issei were allowed to become US citizens. Nisei are the second generation, those born in the US to Issei, and thus are citizens through birthright. Sansei are the third generation and children of Nisei. Yonsei are the fourth generation and children of Sansei. And Gosei are the fifth generation and children of Yonsei. I am deeply grateful and honored to have with us today a group of Minidoka survivors and descendants. Mary Abo is a Nisei Minidoka survivor who was forcibly removed from her home in Alaska. She and her family returned to Alaska after Minidoka. Karen Hirai Olen is a Sansei Minidoka survivor who was born at Minidoka. Her family was living in Washington State prior to forced removal, and her family settled in Twin Falls, Idaho after incarceration. Paul Tomita is a Sansei Minidoka survivor from Washington State, whose family left Minidoka, first living in Washington, D.C., and eventually they returned to Seattle. Wendy Tokuda is a Sansei Minidoka descendant. Her family was forcibly removed from Seattle, Washington, and returned to Seattle after Minidoka. And we have Stephen Kitajo, a Yonsei Minidoka descendant, whose family was living in Seattle before incarceration and returned after. Thank you all for joining us today. So I'd like to start off by asking you what themes from Dr. Nagata's research do you see in your own families? Paul, would you like to start off?
Sure. In Dr. Nagata's report, everything that she reported, it happened. Okay. Differently for different families, but in total, all of us experienced some of it. Okay. And in our situation is that my father, who is also a Kibe, He spent time in his elementary school years in Japan after his father died in California. Um, he and his brother, Ted, they were printers and had a shop on Jackson Street before World War II since 1930. Um, they reacted to the war in a way of being super patriots. You know, they wanted to prove to America that they were true Americans. You know, yeah, even more than they were Japanese. And so they went all out. And as I think you probably know, both my father and my uncle passed the most secure uh, background check. And in the last 2 years of the war, they worked for OSS, Secret Service in DC, Washington, DC. That's why we got out after 16 months in the Assembly Center and in Minidoka. We got out, but also one of the main reasons we got out was I had severe asthma. I was supposed to die there because, of course, I was allergic to dust. And so actually, I don't know if that was one of the main reasons, but my father worked like, you know what, to get us out there. And even then, it took him over almost a year to get us out of there. And I survived, obviously. And yes, we were kind of different. There were only very few Japanese families who were recruited by the federal government to help in the war effort. And so, yes, and it's true. When we went to the East Coast, we were treated just like white people. We were not discriminated against. African Americans in the East Coast were treated a lot worse than we were. And we lived with the white families in the projects in Arlington, Virginia. My father and my uncle recruited for last 2 years back and forth. And then we returned to Seattle after, World War II. But yeah, I mean, that's our experience, and it's probably unusual compared to other families. But yes, initially we had to endure the humiliation of all the things from having a couple of weeks to get ready to get all rid of our stuff to our homes, our car, whatever we had, and ending up in Puyallup, for the 5 months, and then going, being trained over to Minidoka. But yeah, we experienced the same thing as everybody else up until then. But as soon as we got to Minidoka, of course, in our situation was different, and of course, obviously, I survived. I'm still here, and but the fact is, yes, we all suffered, and the information that Dr. Nagata had, presented, yes, it happened. Some of it happened to us, but I also realized that we were lucky. But our grandma, who was an alien, even though she came to America in 1907, she had to stay in the camp for the duration. She was there until October of 1945. In other words, she was there 4 years. And why? Because she was an alien. Well, they wouldn't let her become a naturalized citizen like the Asians and so forth. And so she had to stay there. And we had to leave, because if we didn't leave, Paul Tomita wouldn't be talking to you today. Thank you.
That's a great point, Paul. And, I probably should have started with Mary, because as Dr. Nagata said, the experiences based on your generation are somewhat different. And for Mary, being a Nisei, I think and Mary's the only Nisei on our call today, her experience was different having Issei parents. So Mary, could you share with us a little bit about how you see your family's experience in Dr. Nagata's research?
Yeah, I really appreciated Dr. Nagata's framework so that I could see how my experiences fit in with other Japanese Americans. Since I was born in Juneau, Alaska, we were isolated from other Japanese before the war, so we were different already. My as Dr. Nagata said, that economic security was very important. Luckily, my father had a cafe, so we had, we had a we had food, and my father had respect in the community. He was a boss, so we respected him. What was different is that we lived lived at the cafe. We ate all our meals there, and we only went home to sleep. Our house was very small, so there wasn't very much privacy, much like we had at the barracks in Minidoka. So my parents did argue a lot, and my father did drink, as Dr. Nagata showed, because of the hard life. He drank almost every night, and there was a lot of arguing about that. And it may be after the war, because he continued drinking, that I consciously didn't understand Japanese. Um, I grew up after the war being ashamed of my Japanese identity. I was the only Japanese in our community. I didn't appreciate anything about Japanese, especially since the kids made fun of me. Uh, as I grew up, I remember wondering why my mother revered a picture of the emperor as if he were a god, and why she chanted before a statue of Buddha. I, at the time, was going to the Lutheran church with my friends, and I asked her what she thought of me going to the Lutheran church, and wisely she said, "You live in America. You can believe like an American." So I tried to be as American as I could, as white as I could. Like Dr. Nagata said, I was fearful. I know I lacked self confidence. For instance, I wasn't daring as a child. I can't swim, ride a bike. Now I can't drive busy freeways. I've always wanted to be athletic, but never was. Uh, in my younger years, I lacked confidence in expressing my thoughts. I tended to want to conform, to fit in. It was very important to fit in. My family's ideal for us all was to become educated, go to college, get married to a Japanese, uh, buy a house, buy a car, live the middle class life, to have a better life than they did. So there was lots in Dr. Nagata's research.
Yeah, she did talk about, Nisei, although your dad was Issei, there was they did a study in California, and they said, the Japanese American incarcerated men and women actually had higher rates of alcoholism than their Chinese counterparts. So that's what Mary's referring to. And then also, that ethnic identity, we felt it was bad to be Japanese, a sense of shame, a lack of belonging in this country that you mentioned. Karen, how was it for you being a Sansei and your family, settled in Idaho after incarceration?
Hi, everybody. I've been cogitating on this for the last 2 days, but I kind of grew up in a bubble like Paul. We didn't have discrimination. To this day, no one has ever called me the J word. And we had friends who protected us, and we're beginning to talk about the incarceration with my peer group, with my high school class members. And it was like, we never talked about it. My friends that I grew up with, went to school with, said that wasn't a consideration, that you were Japanese American, that we always felt you were just like us. And so I guess part of it was I bought into that. But the other side of it is that there was also a subgroup that of Japanese families in Twin Falls. So we always shared holidays and birthdays, but there was always a Japanese twist to them. You know, birthdays were always Japanese food, and in Twin Falls, there were no Japanese restaurants, so it was always home cooked Japanese food and sekihan for birthday, and but it was kind of like we lived in two different worlds. There was the JA world that we shared, and then the outside world that we lived in with our peers and our schoolmates.
Wendy, how about you? How do you see your family?
I totally related to Dr. Nagata's research. Totally. And this feeling of, well, we keep saying shame, but it's bigger than that, you know? I never really felt, never really felt like a full American. And I don't think until later in my life did I really understand the depth of impact the internment had on me, because I kept thinking, well, I wasn't there, you know. But when my mom passed away, I was going through her documents, and I found this one sheet paper, the government issued paper she brought from Minidoka, and it was instructions to hunt, internees when you re-enter the world, or helpful hints for a relocation. That was it. And it said things like, do not speak Japanese in public. Don't gather in groups. Remember that some people will have a hard time accepting that you are an American, and you're just going to have to be patient with that, you know. Always remember you are representing all other people, all other Japanese Americans, and you want the people to have a favorable impression of your people. So, keep that in mind. Don't go to honky tonks or taverns, because it will reflect badly on other Japanese Americans, and somebody there might get drunk and, well, basically hurt you, right? And I have not stopped thinking about that document since I uncovered it, and have I realized here in black and white were the instructions. All these Nisei were given on how to raise their children, so we would be safe. So, laying low, not rocking the boat, all of these things that some of you have talked about, I could see in myself, and I could see in my high school was big Japanese JA community, or Asian, but my dad had a drugstore in the community. Most of his clients were either African-American or JA. So we really grew up in that tight-knit Seattle JA community, and it was tight-knit. My doctor was JA, my dentist was JA. I got my gas filled up at the JA gas station. My dry cleaner was JA, because those are people who patronized my dad's drugstore. So, it was a very tight-knit community, and it was I feel these impacts that we're talking about. I could see it in my peers, this hesitancy to, I think, Mary, you were talking about, to take risks, this real overachiever drive, so that we could prove we were good Americans, so we could prove that we had abilities, and so we could find our place in America. And that had real costs. You know, I am a type A overachiever, and that had real costs. It's hard trying to be perfect all the time. And I think that's what a lot of us were doing, or at least trying to stay under the radar, you know, be invisible or be perfect, but definitely don't rock the boat. So I am so grateful for that research that kind of documented this long-term impact it had, you know, coming out of the church, coming out of the camps. My dad really held on to a bitterness, I think, after, you know, losing everything and then having a difficult time buying his own pharmacy back. And when he had been was taken away, he had just started his second pharmacy, opened his second pharmacy, and he had a brand new Chevrolet coupe and had to sell it for nothing. And the stores were just gone. And he never really got over it. And you know, lots of details about all of this stuff that happened to him, you guys, that I'm not going to drag us down with all of that, but with the importance, the thing that is germane to this conversation is that bitterness that he felt, that anger would erupt at, like, you know, strange times. I'd be driving along and someone would stare at us a little too long. You know, what the hell are you staring at? You know, or things like one time, and this was an office often because, you know, we're 5 kids, you know, we didn't have a ton of money, but one time we stayed at a motel someplace. And I remember in the morning, he said, now always leave the place better than when you found it, because so they'll have a good impression of Japanese. So we all made our beds perfectly, you know, like, so they looked exactly like they did when we came into the motel. We're cleaning everything, you know, and everywhere we went, we tried to do that. Like, you know, we were ambassadors when we stepped outside of our little community, you know. I think there was a huge amount of pressure on Sanseis to do well in school. It was brutal, to be honest with you. You know, I had so many friends, they knew in junior high that they had to become doctors. And a lot of them did, you know, or engineers or something where your accomplishments were measurable. It wasn't something, you know, because you were only going to be judged. You had to have something concrete to show your value. You could not depend on things visible, because we all knew what happened to us during World War II, you know. There was a fear. There was a true fear. And, you know, there's a reason why none of us learned Japanese. You guys speak Japanese, any of you? Well, you know, don't speak Japanese in public. I couldn't speak with my grandparents. And later in life, I realized what a loss that was. What a loss. And they had the best of intentions doing it. They just wanted us to fit in.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, no, that's, thank you for sharing some of your experiences with your parents, you know. And I think one of the big themes, you know, she talked about was the silence, and how that silence really impacted all of us, and confusion, and how they communicated.
You know, they didn't talk about it, but all of the humiliation they faced they were prisoners. It took me a long time to say, my parents met in a prison camp. I am the child of prisoners. You don't walk out of those gates and everything is okay. You carry all of that humiliation and that pain and the loss of those years, and then have it like go away when you have kids. We felt all of their trauma. We felt it, whether they said the words or not. We felt all of those feelings. It did not stop when they left the gates. And those are the things that became, we were immersed in it. We were immersed in it. So they were communicating all the time what they experienced You know, we may not have known where all of it came from until later, but we grew up immersed in it.
Right. The silence told us something because there was confusion about this time, and that we knew that we weren't supposed to ask about it or say anything. And so Dr. Nagata talked about that a lot. And then also how it resonated with the Yonsei, but also how they were raised at a different time. And so how that impacted them differently. So Stephen, would you share a little bit about your experience as a Yonsei?
Yeah, I think as a Yonsei growing up very early on, I was very much American rather than Japanese American, I'd have to say. You know, there were some elements of JA culture that I grew up with, but not, not too many, not as many, I think as maybe like my parents might have had, or at least my mom. But I know on my dad's side, I think his parents, my grandparents, raised him and his siblings to be very American. They were supposed to do well in school, join Boy Scouts, do all these things that were very American, even to their names. If I look at my dad's side of the family versus my mom's side, I can see the difference in how, a lot of family members on my mom's side have Japanese middle names, or even Japanese, names that are commonly used. Whereas my dad's side, everyone has a very American name, American first name, American middle name. So having that contrast between the two sides of my family has helped me see these differences a lot clearer than I think I might otherwise have. But on both sides, there was very much a silence about talking about camp experiences. It wasn't really something that I was taught as part of family history when I was younger. I was fortunate enough to have a classmate, a JA classmate, whose grandfather would come in to our elementary school class and talk about his experience in camp. But when I would ask my parents, what our family history in camp was, they didn't really have an idea, because that information was never passed down to them by their parents, because they just didn't talk about it. And in a way, I think that has pushed me,
Oh, do we lose his sound?
Oh, Stephen, we lost your sound for a minute.
Okay.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Where should I go back to?
Just the last few sentences.
Okay. So I was talking about how I didn't know a lot of the history. When I asked my parents, they didn't know the history either. It was never passed down to them from their parents. And I think that I know at least there's regret.
Oh,
We lost you again, Stephen. That's okay. Well, actually, let's go along those themes. One of the themes she did talk about was kind of this loss. There was this loss of cultural heritage in some respect, because our families had to leave a lot behind of their belongings behind. But at the same time, they were able to maintain kind of this positive. There's some positives about incarceration that she mentioned, like the Japanese cultural values that help the community after. Would anyone like to talk a little bit about that? Karen?
Well, I think that, like Stephen and Wendy, my parents never talked about camp to us. When my mom's childhood friends would come and visit us. They would speak to each other in Japanese about camp. So we assumed it was something they didn't want us to know. So therefore, we assumed it was bad. And but there were certain things that, cultural things, or I don't know, maybe they were just manners, that we were always, things about, I don't know if it's culture, respecting elders, and to be sure that whenever there were guests in your home, that you accommodated them first in terms of when your meals or whatever. But I think the other thing were probably like holidays. We always celebrated New Year's with typical Oshogatsu stuff. And but the other side of it is they tried to make sure we were totally American, made sure we celebrated the 4th of July appropriately, and, with fireworks and, all that stuff. So it was kind of, we had to be 200% American. Plus, there was another part of us that was allowed to be Japanese, quote unquote. But because I grew up in Twin Falls, my Japaneseness, there's a word that always had kind of tinged with Hagujin. So my California friend said, you have your Hagujin ways. And I didn't understand that until I lived in LA for about 10 years.
Yeah. So Paul, how about for you, the difference, Karen, she was raised in Twin Falls. How about for you going back to Seattle and being within a Japanese American community?
Yeah, okay. Post-World War II, the majority of Japanese who lived in Seattle did return. And I noticed is that, our family we're generational Buddhist, okay, from Japan. And so, of course, growing up post-World War II, initially anyway, most of the ministers, the Buddhist ministers, were from Japan. So we got Japanese, okay? We heard enough Japanese that we knew what it was sounded like, and like pronunciation. We generally kind of pronounced it similar to, or at least something close to how they pronounced it in Japan. And so we always had that, kind of a Japanese thing, plus the fact Grandma lived with us before World War II, and Grandma lived with us after World War II, because my father was the eldest male in the family. So she lived with us, even though my mother didn't care for it. But that's another thing. That's another thing. That's another story. But the thing here, and so we always had Japanese around. And yes, the worst mistake I ever made was refusing to learn Japanese, even though it was free and it was provided by the temple. I personally harassed the Japanese, the lady who was trying to teach us Japanese after World War II. I'm guilty.
So
I'm guilty.
bad. You're so
I
bad.
am guilty. We made fun of her.
Oh.
We made fun of that poor woman, and I regret it. Of course, 83 years old now. And of course, my Japanese is pitiful, and it's my fault. But it took me years to figure it out. Okay. But again, yeah. And so, we did have probably more acquaintances with being Japanese and the language particularly, okay, than, let's say, those Japanese relatives or friends of ours who were Christian or nothing. They had no affiliation. So yes, on that part we did. And fortunately for us, our temple, we always did have parental participation, both parents. And so we usually had, and we organized a lot of things that Japanese American children could participate in because, yes, even post World War II and maybe even worse, we were not invited to participate in a lot of white activities that our white friends in school were automatically okay to. So, and so our parents were smart enough to say, okay, in order to keep our kids interested in being, participating, is we have to start these things. We have to start the Boy Scouts. We have to start the Cub Scouts. We have to start the Campfire Girls. We have to do everything to make up for the being shunned by the white dominant community. Okay, even in Seattle, they discriminated against us, but they did it nicely. Okay, they didn't tell us get the hell out of here, but they made it plain. You don't belong here. Go somewhere else. And as a result, our temple was really good, and our ministers and particularly our parents made sure that they filled the gap. Okay, so that we would turn out at least half normal. In the end. In other words, we had a place to go to. And places like, for instance, Wendy, your dad's drugstore, hey, it was a hangout.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Everybody went
Yeah.
there. Huh? And
Yeah.
you had that soda fountain
Oh my God,
there.
yes.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that was my favorite thing. I would do anything to go and sit there, and your mom would make us, the floats and all this different kind of stuff.
Yeah, it was my first job, Paul.
Oh, hey.
Yeah, root beer floats, Coke floats.
Yeah, the Tokuda sold me on that.
There you
Definitely. It was one of my favorite activities to go to. But see, and the Japanese community, we knew that we were being discriminated against, and so we had to come up with activities to fill our children in our community with some hope or with some activity, so that we wouldn't go nuts, that we would just be sitting there alone, and and hit the sauce and do very inappropriate things. And so what we did was, yes, the Japanese American community, we made a concerted effort to provide activities, particularly for our youth. And again, hey, this is why, and I'm a product of that. If I didn't have that, other than the YMCA, what would I do? What other things would I, in the white Boy Scouts, in the community, they didn't want us there. So, where would we have? So what did we do? We started our own Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls and all the other kinds of stuff. Because if they didn't do that, our parents didn't do that, basically Niseis, but also Iseis, if they didn't do that, we would have turned out to be a real mess, today,
Well,
Yeah,
and I think that, go ahead.
go ahead. I actually think psychologically, you said half normal. I think you're right there. I think there was some real damage done to. I mean, I just think
Yes.
about all the JAs I went to school with and went to church. I
Yeah.
went to Japanese Presbyterian church, and
Yeah.
And you're right about creating our own activities, but there was real psychological damage. I mean, we knew there was something wrong with us. We didn't belong, we
Yes.
didn't fit out there.
No, we didn't.
It was like
didn't.
living in two worlds, two
Yeah.
separate worlds. Well,
Yeah.
and so Mary, I'd like to go to Mary, hearing how it was for you to return, Karen, for your family to be in Twin Falls, and Paul and Wendy for your family to be in Seattle with the Japanese American community. I wanted to ask Mary what it was like for her in Alaska when her family returned. And then I want to go back to Stephen for a moment.
Coming back to Juneau was a great experience for my father because he was kind of like an essential worker owning a cafe. He was able to get the cafe back because it was located where the mine and lumber mill and fishermen were, and he supplied the 3 meals a day. So it was good. His business prospered. He was able to get loans from German baker and a German grocer, and they said, "You don't have to pay us back till you are solvent again." So
Wow.
we fit in. But we were separated. We also lived in two worlds like everyone else. There was downtown where we lived and uptown where the white people lived. I thought it was interesting where people mentioned silence, and Wendy's the list of how to behave sounded very much like what I got as a list as a teacher taking a drug and alcohol class, where they said, do not, if there's someone in your family that has done something wrong, do not spread it. Stay within the family, protect that person, and do not let it go out. And I think this silence is what other people have talked about too, is not only shame, but it was also inadequate language. We didn't have the vocabulary. We couldn't speak to our parents couldn't speak to us. So I think maybe like in Stephen's generation, now there is a common vocabulary that they could exchange, but it was really difficult with Iseis and Niseis. And also, I thought that the work, it was very important to work. That was one way to rise. And so work is very endemic in our family. If you don't do your parts, someone else has to do it for you. So that is a value that was very important in my family. And I think it helped.
Yeah. Stephen? Stephen, would you share a little bit more? I know we got cut off a little earlier.
Share more about going back to question 1.
Yeah, just your family, continuing with your family, how you see your family, or you as a Yonsei experiencing this.
I think one of the biggest things that I noticed from Dr. Nagata's research that I saw in my own life is kind of that need to achieve and achieve greater things than, what my parents and grandparents achieved. And I definitely remember, feeling a need to not disappoint, not just my parents, but also my grandparents, because they would, say oh, wouldn't it be nice if you were this, or you did this, and I think that gets into your mind, gets into your head a little bit, and makes you feel like you need to do these things to, I guess, make them happy or make them proud. And I think I lived a lot of my life like that, just doing all the extracurricular activities, trying to do my best academically. And I think in a lot of ways that there was a trade-off. There was definitely a trade-off that I didn't see, probably until after I graduated from college. And then I was like, well, now what? There's no longer, a lot of all those extracurriculars and that need to achieve academically. It ends, once you're done, once I got through college, and it was, made me look back on that and really examine it and see that was kind of an effect of my upbringing.
Well, Dr. Nagata, she talked about the Yonsei being more focused on social justice and also activists. And could you talk a little bit about your role on the Minidoka pilgrimage planning committee?
Yeah, I I became involved with the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee in about 2012, and it was mainly to learn more about my family history because, again, my parents didn't know it. And my grandparents on my mom's side that were in Minidoka, my grandmother passed before I was born, and my grandfather passed when I was still quite young, and he had a lot of health issues that, I never had a conversation with him ever, just because of his health issues. And getting involved in that, going on the pilgrimage, kind of moved me past learning about my family history and learning more about the broader history. And with that came learning about the causes and also the parallels throughout history and even in the present. And I'm sure many that will come up in the future. And then having gone through that, kind of looking inward to myself and saying, what can I do now to prevent this from happening? Because I think being able to clearly see how intergenerational trauma, not just for myself, but also maybe my peers, other family members, seeing that and wanting to prevent that in other communities to other people was a big motivation for my work with the Pilgrimage Planning Committee and also my other interests outside of that that are very much social justice related.
So then actually, I just want to ask a quick question before we close out with our final question, but how many of you have actually been to Minidoka and part of the pilgrimage, and what impact did that have on you in this healing process?
Well, I've been, I think, 3 times to Minidoka, and I brought my sister the first time. She's 8 years older than me, and she didn't want to go, but I talked her into it, and she said she was glad she went there because she could revisit a traumatic period and not feel, she could feel that she had passed that point of fear. And I went again with my daughter and her children, and that was really good because they really feel that I've shared a part of my history with them, and I think she understands, what our family went through. So yeah, Minidoka, being on there and being with others and being with the younger people as well as the older people, everyone sharing their experience, it just makes you feel like really like you belong.
Paul, you were recently at Minidoka.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I've been going on site to Minidoka since, I guess, early 2000s. Because one day during that time, my wife said, "Paul, when was the last time you were at Minidoka?" And then I says, "When we got out in 1943, and something like 50 years had passed." And she said, "Don't you think that you would like to go there and take a look before you die?" And so we started going, and I started going. And actually this last time in June, after the pandemic and so forth, I went with my wife, and I was there in early June. And the interesting part of this last visit, though, was I had expressed to Kurt Ikeda, the one of the leaders at Minidoka, and I had asked Kurt, would it be possible if I could actually visit the actual site where our block and barracks were?
Wow.
And all these years now, I've never seen it from the early 2000 until now. I've never actually stepped on that thing. So while I was there in June, Kurt says, "Hey, how would you like me to take?" And I had asked him before. He says, "How would you like to take me on actual site?" And he says, "It's still owned by a white farmer, okay, that area. And he says, but I have a good relationship with him. And so if we take the park, service car, let's go. And so boom, he took me there. And again, and I took pictures and videos and so forth. And again, I had not stepped on that soil where Barracks 12, Block 12, Barracks 5, Section E. I had not ever been on there since July 4th, Independence Day, 1943. And so, yes, I thought that my last visit was very significant, Robin, because I was actually, for the first time, I actually was, sucking up the dirt that I was sucking up in 1942, 43. And I was actually on that, holy ground, and yes, I like that.
Karen, would you like to add anything?
Well, since I've become a volunteer to Friends of Minidoka, I've spent a lot of time at the site, including yesterday. But I think that one of the things that still affects me deeply is that I think the reparations hearings and stuff gave the Nisei permission to talk about it with each other, and in a way to let us know what really happened to them, and on some levels what they felt about it. Thank God for the pilgrimages, because I was able to talk my mother into going one year. I moved back to Idaho in 2006, so I think it was 2008. And I had talked with her about going before, and she said no. And then I said, well, the next year I said, I signed you up. And my mother, being Nisei, is very thrifty. So she didn't want to see that money go to waste. So she went. And then the next year she invited her two sisters to join us. And that was
wow,
really interesting, where I learned about a lot of things that they would talk about amongst themselves, and knew that I was there. And I think they did it for my benefit. And because I was 18 months old when we moved out of camp. And so I think that the pilgrimages, I think, really benefited the Nisei community. I think also my mom being able to see other Niseis, it was a safe place for her and her sisters to share their experiences with each other, which I think was really interesting to them, because they would see people and they'd say, oh, remember when blah, blah, blah. And they even talked about pre-evacuation. Do you remember when this family or that family needed different things? So I just hope the pilgrimages start again.
Yeah, I do too.
Because the Sansei and the Yonsei and the Gosei really need to be involved in that in a group kind of way. And Dr. Nakata talks about the waterfall effect of the shame, the silence. I'm still trying to piece together my parents' journey after they left Minidoka, because they still wouldn't talk about it. Mom called it the lost years. And so, but I think that I hope that the Yonsei and the Gosei get to experience a pilgrimage and to get a perspective about what their families went through, collectively and then individually and as families.
Thank you, Karen. So my very last closing question for all of you is, this series with the Idaho Humanities Council is funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities program, A More Perfect Union. As we pursue this more perfect union for our country, what do you hope people will take away from our discussion today? Wendy, would you like to start?
Well, I mean, my great hope is that we can become, and our stories and our history can become an accepted part of the greater history of this country. Because right now, of course, it's a very strange time in American history, and there's such division, and, you know, books about the internment. One book has been banned, and you know, any talk of things that happen, it creates more division. You know, like, you're saying these things to make us feel guilty, that, you know, make us feel guilty. And I just think it's so important to know not just what happened, but the lasting effects of something like this happening to anyone. To anyone. These stories, you know, I want them to be woven into the great American history.
Stephen, share some of your thoughts.
I think that people to take away a greater understanding of intergenerational trauma and the lasting effects that, you know, these actions can have is important, because this intergenerational trauma can happen and has happened to so many people because of various injustices, and that is something that we can unite around, is a desire to, you know, our quest for justice and wanting to ensure that this trauma is not inflicted on anyone else. I don't know how anyone can say that they would not be in favor of that. And working towards, you know, making sure that the lessons from our history continue to be learned, so that we remember what we need to do to avoid this in the future and to work towards a better future for everyone.
Stephen, Paul?
Okay, my statement is that my hope, of course, for America is that what happened to us 80 years ago never happens again. And one way that we can work toward that goal is, you know, we Japanese Americans and, you know, the aliens and all of our grandmas and grandpas went through hell, okay? And we are in the ideal position to speak up and say, hey, America, particularly I'm talking to white America. Hey, America, you know, you did this to us. You know, the few of us are still alive to say it, but also we also have to step forward. You know, I don't care to what level it is, but we descendants, survivors, whoever it is, we have to step forward and remind white America, you know, don't ever do that again to anybody. You know, they're not going to do it to us, you know, again, but they are, you know, we have people here in America who have no problems doing it to the latest group, huh? be they Muslims, be they, African Americans, be they Native Americans, be they whatever, and we have to step forward and say, we went through this hell and it ain't pretty and it is not American. Okay. It is not democratic. And we are in the best position to step forward and say, we experienced it. It was crappy. It was hell.
Karen?
I think that the message that I would like to see as a result of this is that for the JA community, I think that we've been traumatized with the concept that being JA is a bad thing. The silence from our parents and so forth. And I would like to see, I think it's a message, but it's also a value that we as JAs need to incorporate into our ethic, is that one, we need to learn there's nothing wrong with us. We, either in any way. And two, there is a positive, very enhancing value to perpetuating our cultural systems that we grew up with. And I think that the next generations, I would like to see incorporated. We did nothing wrong. We were victims. But I think also we need to learn to step away from the victim mode and see that we prevail in terms of our values and what we see as right. I don't know how we're going to get there, but
Mary?
Well, I see the future being very different than how we've experienced it. I think the JA identity will start to fade because our children are marrying, intermarrying. It's going to be elusive, but I think the essence of our experience is to learn and be empathetic for all people. We have to have we have to glean what's good from our experience and the strength that we've got from it. But I think for sure the JA identity will be elusive. I think it's important that we learn to ally with other groups and be an ally. For instance, Friends of Minidoka's uh, objection to the 400 giant wind farms. It's not just the JAs, but as Robin knows, we have environmentalists, conservationists, politicians, ranchers, farmers joining with the Japanese Americans who want to preserve Minidoka. So I believe there's going to be big changes, and we have a lot to contribute from our experiences.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your stories and your family's experiences with us today. I deeply appreciate your time today. We also hope the viewers of this series will come visit Minidoka National Historic Site in Jerome, Idaho. The visitor center is open for the season and tours with the park rangers are available through Labor Day weekend. To learn more, you can visit the website for Minidoka National Historic Site. And we also want to extend a last thank you to the Idaho Humanities Council for including Friends of Minidoka and Minidoka National Historic Site in the Connected Conversations program. We deeply appreciate their partnership and support in telling the lessons and legacy of Minidoka.